foundationally, young men are really in decline. There are less men that are sexually active between the ages of 18 and 29 right now. There are less men graduating college. There are less men in the workforce. And there is the highest rate of men living at home than ever before. But I think that we actually just need to bring grounded, healthy, masculine energy back into our culture. And how we do that is we bring it back into the conversations. We bring it back into the systems where young men are growing up. In the book, I talk about what's called the one rule of men. You don't talk about what it's like to be a man. And that was one of the things that I bought into. I had to start to break that rule and just talk to the guys in my life and say, listen, this is what's been going on. This is where I've been struggling. It started to not only empower me, but disenfranchise the beliefs that had led me down the path of self-destruction and self-sabotage.
When we start to drop these facades, particularly with the people that we're closest to, first of all, it just feels good because it gets it out into the open. It gives others permission to really open up about what they're going through.
I told one of my best friends that I had known for quite a few years what had been going on behind the scenes. He paused and got very emotional, and he proceeded to tell me that he'd been struggling with depression, and it had gotten so bad that he had tried to end his life 6 weeks before this conversation. I knew so much about this man, except for the deepest part of him, and vice versa. And I just started to see that in so many of my male relationships, that they were just this surface level conversation that was happening. And I didn't want that anymore.
Connor Beaton, welcome to The Great Unlearn.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Yeah, you're on a bit of a podcast tour promoting your new book.
I am. Yeah, it's a pretty cool thing. It's like the thing that you do when you write a book nowadays, right? You don't go on traditional media. You do the podcasting thing. It's much better, and much more fun because you get to meet cool people like yourself. So it's great.
Well, it's funny. I'm just finishing up my own book, and I've reached out to a few friends who've done books in the past, and one of them who's been really successful with it was really pushing that traditional, you got to go on all these morning shows, you got to do this, got to do that. I was like, okay, God, that seems like a lot of work. And then I talked to, another friend who's kind of more in the space right now. He's like, no, bro, you're just going on podcasts.
Yeah. There's like I think that the mainstream shows, like the morning shows and stuff like that, they can help with certain aspects of it in terms of the New York Times bestselling list, for example. I think they require you to have a certain amount of media, like mainstream media, in order to be eligible to even get onto the list. So it's not just about book sales, which is a very interesting thing. You have to gamify the list in some way. But yeah, but podcasts are where it's at, man. That's it. You get to have cool conversations. It's long form. You can go a little bit deeper than you normally can in the sort of mainstream media conversations.
Yeah, they're more snippets, right? Which is, you have your own podcast called ManTalks.
That's right. Yeah, the ManTalks show.
Yeah, and then it came out of the program that you started by the same name, right? Yeah,
I was actually, I've been running the podcast now for like 7 years, and it's really started to take off in last year. Like last year, we doubled our size and all that kind of stuff. But I didn't really want to start a podcast in the beginning, but a guy that worked with me years ago was a podcast fanatic. And he's like, you got to start a podcast. You got to start a podcast. And I was like, I don't even listen to podcasts. Like, why the hell would I do that? And, but it's one of those things where you hire people that know better than you,? And so I listened and I was like, okay, sure. Like, let's give this a try. And then I became hooked on it, just having these really wonderful conversations. I mean, I've talked to astrophysicists and cosmologists and, people that were eligible for Nobel Prizes and some of the top psychologists and professors at Stanford and Harvard. I mean, it's led to a kind of education, for myself, which has been beautiful because this is how I learn. I think it's how a lot of us learn, this art of sitting down with experts and masters and sort of learning from them versus this very academic approach that we've taken in our society of, just memorize shit and then regurgitate it versus sitting down with people who have spent a lifetime on something and being able to get wisdom and knowledge from them.
Yeah.
So.
And you take that, right? And then you go have your own experience with it to see what part of it really sticks with you. And it's a much different way. It's much more approachable for things, especially with some of the guests that you just shared. It seems so heady and outside of, for me, my comfort zone. But the way those conversations go, you start to pull little nuggets that allow you to kind of follow those kind of breadcrumbs.
Yeah. And I've always been a deeply curious person. And so I can sit with most anybody and be curious enough to just, extract some kind of cool story or insight into their life or their area of expertise in a way that I think is engaging. And so, yeah, it's been a blast, man. It's been a blast. And getting to come on other people's shows. I think, I've done, 60, 70 interviews now in the last 2 months. And getting insight into how other people interview is also such a craft and skill of its own. People that are really good at interviewing. There's so much to learn there. And there's an artistry in that as well, I think. So, yeah, it's been awesome.
Yeah. What do you attribute the bump in audience size?
I think a couple things. One, so we've never done any traditional marketing. I've never paid $1 for advertising for the show before. One, I think I started to get more intentional with the guests that I was having on, because for a little while, it was kind of like anybody that I was just interested in talking to and was curious about. And that kind of cast a very wide net. And then I started to narrow it down into, okay, let's talk to psychologists and evolutionary psychologists and, the top therapists and really talk about and explore the depths of how do we as men, because the show's about men and for men, how do we as men get the most out of ourselves? And so when I really started to sort of niche down into something specific, that's when it seemed to really start to grow. And then so that's one part. And then secondly, just doing this actually, which was going on other people's shows. And I think, people started to come back to my show because they were curious about, me and my work. And so I think those two things really helped. And then I think the final thing is word of mouth. One of the things I learned when I started ManTalks in the very beginning is we were putting on these small events. And the very first one was in this this investment company's brick and mortar store, right? Shop. And I was putting on this event, and the whole concept behind ManTalks was I was going to bring in 3 or 4 guys, and they were going to tell their life story. They had 20 minutes to tell their life story as if they were going to die the next day. And so they had to share sort of their 3 defining moments in life or 2 defining moments in life and the lesson that they wanted to leave the world with out of those defining moments. And, the first event, we had 50 people there, right? And I told everybody about it. I tried to get everybody out. But it was just so powerful that people started to tell other people. And I realized that. And then, at the end of every event, I said, if you just do one thing after this event, it's going to tell one person about what you learned here. And that became something where suddenly we were doing 300 people a month were coming out to the events, and 400 people a month were coming out to the events. And then I popped it up in different cities around North America, and same thing. And so I think with the podcast, I've just really encouraged people to what I call man it forward, right? Man it forward, share this conversation with somebody that needs it, because sometimes these dialogues hold in them keys to self-understanding that people are really searching for. Or they're just cool ideas, in a time where there's just so much chaos. So I think those are the 3 things, really just encouraging people to share is something that's so valuable, because human recommendation is still the most valuable testimony, right? It's if you go on Yelp and there's 400 reviews that are all this is the most amazing place, but your buddy is that place is garbage. Do not go there. You're probably not going to go there.
Yeah.
Right. And so we still really value other people's perspective, especially people around us. And so I've really encouraged my audience to just, just like share with your boyfriend or your girlfriend or your buddy, or, if you think that there's somebody in your life that's going to benefit from this conversation, then send it to them. And that's really, really worked well.
Yeah. And it's a simple ask. And I'm guessing that you have a really deft way of articulating it, so it doesn't feel like a kind of sales pitch. It's like, look, if there's anything here that's resonant, just share it. Yeah. And I do want to bring up one point, even though it's called ManTalks, and you kind of touch on it there, your boyfriend or girl, like it's for men, but it's also a great guide for women to understand what the fuck it means to be a dude in the stuff that we really struggle with.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of women are trying to make sense of men in our modern culture, because as men and masculinity within our culture has become more vague, less valued, I think, within our culture. Men have changed quite a bit. And so I think women are trying to make sense of like, what are men going through? I think the women that are curious and that have empathy and compassion are genuinely trying to figure out like, what are men going through in our culture right now? And there's not a lot of spaces or places that are talking about that in a way that, isn't hyper politicized or has a very specific religious undercurrent to it. And so to have a nonpartisan, non-religious take on what's happening with men within our culture, and because I talk with men, that are experts, but I also do these live sessions where I'll work with men and put it out there. And so they're anonymous guests, men that apply to work with me. And so I think it gives insight into what men's work can look like. And I think that helps a lot of men understand themselves, understand their own process. But I think it also helps a lot of women understand like, oh, interesting. Like that's not what I would have felt if that thing happened with my dad or with my brother or with my, partner or whatever it is. And so I think that it's a good place for women to also come to learn about men.
Yeah. I want to back up just a little bit. As I was reading a little bit more about your story, I saw that at some point you were living in your car. Is that right?
Yeah.
Like how did that come to be?
So the short version of it is I bottomed out. I bottomed out, and I had this internal notion and unconscious story that I think a lot of us as men have, that nothing in my life was going to change until everything sort of fell apart. And I think in some ways it's because we lack initiation as men in our culture. And so when we lack initiation, we sort of cross this threshold from being a boy to being an adolescent to being a man. But there's no real demarcation between I'm a boy and I'm a man now. And so a lot of us, myself included, we start to create these pseudo initiations. We start to create these self-inflicted initiations where everything is stripped away from us. And we create an environment where we are powerless, where we need to sort of dig ourselves back out of this hole. And we do that because in some ways we're trying to reconcile with our own sense of power. And we're trying to reconcile with, can I go through an incredibly hard time and come out the other side stronger, more courageous, more whole, more capable, more competent, more able to actually contribute to society. And so for me, what it looked like was I was completely out of integrity, right? I was lying. I was cheating in my relationships. I was abusing substances. I had a very bad problem with pornography, and no one knew what was going on. Like just no one knew, on the surface. If you had met me, it's like I was traveling the world. I had this cool career. I was a musician. I had this great relationship. I was riding the motorcycle. I had the 5-liter Mustang. I had the things that coming from Northern Alberta, I thought were the measure of success as a man. Oof. And but behind the scenes, I was really struggling and suffering. And so all of those things fell apart, and they all fell apart at once. Girlfriend found out that I had been cheating for a long time, and my career came to a halt, and I was questioning whether or not I wanted to.
What were you doing at that time?
I was a classical singer. So I was traveling the world. I was singing opera essentially. And so all that came to a halt, and I had so much shame, but also this sense of I need to figure this out by myself, and this stubbornness that I didn't want to tell anybody. I didn't want anybody to know. And I was still caught in this false sense of like, can I talk my way out of this? Like, please, can I just talk my way out of this shit show that I've created? Which I couldn't, obviously, and there was a reason for that. But I moved all my stuff into storage, and I just lived out of the back of my car for a few weeks because I didn't want people to know what was going on. And I was trying to rationalize how I could get myself out of the problem. And, within 2 days living in the back of my car, I realized very quickly that was not going to be possible. And so there was a kind of reckoning, there was a kind of, again, pseudo initiation into how do I actually want to handle this? How do I actually want to show up in life? Who do I actually want to be? Because this isn't working. And I was, fortunate enough to have an older mentor in my life who was in his early 70s, named Bernard. And I had a conversation with him where I sort of told him what was going on, not the full extent of it, but, just that I'd been living in the back of my car and there was some stuff that had transpired. And he invited me over to his place, and, I went and sat down and had a few-hour conversation with him, and that would turn into a 2.5-year apprenticeship where he sort of took me under his wing, and he was well-versed in Jungian psychology and cognitive behavioral therapy and Buddhism and Zen and Taoism.
Bro, that's quite the mentor.
Yeah. And so this like little French Canadian Yoda showed up in my life,
Yeah.
And really altered the trajectory of where I was going. So that's why I was in the car and, living in the back of my car. And it sort of led me on this path that I've been on ever since. So yeah.
Damn.
Yeah.
What did climbing out of that hole look like?
Oh,
What were some of the steps, maybe the real simple steps in the beginning that started to shift things for you? What gave you hope besides maybe how Bernard showed up?
I started to, because he was so into Jungian psychology, into Carl Jung and his work, I started to read a lot about the shadow and archetypes and all of these pieces. And one of the things that really hit me is Jung talked about the first step in any therapeutic process and the first step in any religious or spiritual process is some form of confession, some form of admission. And that was the part that I really disliked, and I had really been avoiding for a very long time. Like just admitting that things behind the scenes in my life weren't going well.
And I'm going to guess, again, just because I know a little bit about your story, is part of that originated from you wanting to be a good guy and be liked and the external validation. And if you show that side, people won't like me. I'll be a fraud. I'll be all those things. And it's so fragile, that ego part of what we develop.
Yeah.
I resonate with that, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I had built up this persona of being this nice guy, that and I think that it's part of the challenge that comes with the modern, cultural narrative and societal narrative that says to men, in order to be a good man, you have to be nice. And if you're not nice, you're not a good man. And that's, it's very baked into our culture, especially if you live in, more urban areas, more liberal areas. It's very prominent. And so I had done everything to make sure that I was just a good guy, and that people liked me and that I was nice and that I didn't piss people off. And it really had backfired, because I had to separate from these parts of myself, my assertiveness, my anger, different parts of my desires. And that's just not, it's not functional, right? It's not operating from a whole place. So, the first thing that I had to do was to start to admit what was going on, plain and simple. And in the book, I talk about what's called the one rule of men, because I started to see it in so many of the men that were in my life, which was the one rule of men is like Fight Club, right? In Fight Club, there's one rule, and it's you don't talk about Fight Club, right? Like that's it.
Yeah.
And Fight Club is just it's a sort of like a deconstruction of masculinity, right? It's a thesis on modern masculinity in a really beautiful way. But the one rule of men is you don't talk about what it's like to be a man who is struggling or suffering. And many of us buy into that. And that was one of the things that I had bought into. Don't talk about where you feel weak, you feel insecure, things are going wrong. But if you do talk about it, just complain. Don't actually do it in a way that's generative or actually helpful. And so I had to start to break that rule and just talk to the guys in my life and say, listen, this is what's been going on. This is where I've been struggling. This is where things haven't been going well. This is where I've been out of integrity. And in doing that, it had this wonderful effect where it started to not only empower me, but disenfranchise the beliefs that had led me down the path of self-destruction and self-sabotage. Because in many ways, you have to have a kind of bold courage and willingness to really face the depths of your fear, because there's nothing like telling people, I've been lying, or I've been cheating, or I've been out of control, or here's what I've been doing that's been harmful to my relationship, or whatever it is, or here's where I'm struggling. There's nothing like admitting those things to the people that we love, because there's oftentimes a deep fear of, what if I then don't belong with these people, right? What if they reject me? What if they see me in the way that I see myself, right? Because I thought I was a piece of shit. I thought I was broken. And so if I admit that these things are going on, what if they judge me in the way that I judge myself? And I think that's the conundrum and the paradox that all of us are faced with when we're carrying something, whether it's grief from a divorce or the death of a parent, and we don't know how to deal with it, or whatever it is. There's this deep fear of, what if I tell somebody who I love, who I admire, who I respect, and they reject me, or they judge me in the same way that I've been rejecting myself. So that was really one of the first fundamental steps that I had to take. And when I did it, there's this saying that vulnerability begets vulnerability. When I did it, I truly was shocked. And it seems like the most obvious thing now, but the men in my life that I started to open up to and talk to, they really, they really mirrored it back, and they started to be honest and transparent about where they were struggling in life and the problems that they were dealing with, and the challenges in their relationship, the challenges in their business that I just didn't know about. And so the facade that had lived between us as friends, as brothers, started to drop, and the real versions of us as men started to appear. And it was in this one conversation, and I wrote about it in the book, and I'll pause because I feel like I've said it a lot. But it was in this one conversation where I told one of my best friends that I'd known for quite a few years what had been going on behind the scenes, and just sort of laid it all out. And he paused and he got very emotional, and he thanked me for being so honest with him. And he proceeded to tell me that he had been struggling with depression, and it had gotten so bad that he had tried to end his life about 6 weeks before this conversation. And, in that moment, I was really sort of dumbstruck by the fact that I thought I knew everything about this guy. I liked the women. I knew the women that he liked to date. I knew the type of scotch he liked to drink, the TV shows he liked to watch, where he liked to go and get food. Like, I knew so much about this man, except for the deepest part of him and what he was really dealing with, and vice versa. And I just started to see that in so many of my male relationships, that they were just this surface level conversation that was happening that really lacked depth and substance. And I didn't want that anymore. and that became the sort of fuel for me to start ManTalks. And that wouldn't happen for years later, 5 or 6 years later. But that conversation, my rock bottom, became the sort of fuel for me to do something about that later.
Oh, that's beautiful. That was, yeah, you did say a lot, and it was all really important. I think one of the gifts is that when we share these stories, particularly as men, it opens up others to be honest about what's going on. It lets them know, like, look, there may be this way you see me and that I've got everything figured out and my life is great, but this is actually what's going on. And I know for me, starting the podcast was very cathartic because I felt like people just didn't understand who I was.
Mm.
And I didn't want to be perceived as a fraud. But I also didn't want to do it for sympathy, but it was like, look, like I'm just as fucked up as everybody else. And here are the ways that I'm sharing that, for today, this is what's coming up and this is where I'm really struggling. And this is where I don't have it figured out. And these are the things that I still stumble over time and again. And I love the sharing because it did, I guess, this admission, this confession, first of all, it just feels good because it gets it out into the open. But then it does. I think the beauty of it is it gives others permission to really open up about what they're going through.
Yeah. When you say that you felt like people didn't know you, I can't remember exactly how you said that. What did you mean by that? That they saw a sort of like image of you, or?
Yeah, like, let's say 5-6 years ago, or, I started the podcast 3 years ago. So as I was, kind of getting ready to launch this thing, here I was, I retired from trading at 41, have done really well financially, really fit, in good shape, take care of myself, have a beautiful wife, 3 awesome kids, like multiple boxes checked.
Mm.
And in those ways, it just felt like, yeah, but there's shit that I'm still struggle with. Like, yeah, so those things are great.
Mm.
It's not it. And, yeah, maybe there was a part of me that wanted people like that. That was my way to reach out and say, look, I need help too.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That was kind of my cry for help in getting honest with people, just so they could see me more of the whole me. And don't get me wrong, like they saw those things for a long time because that was maybe an unconscious choice for me to put up those different masks so people saw the best version of me. So that I was a good guy, that I was likable, that people wanted to be like that. But when you carry that for so long, it becomes really burdensome. And then to start to let go of those different layers, it allowed me to really start to understand who I am and why I'm here, and start to get really curious about what is my greater purpose. It's not for attaining financial wealth. It's not for being really physically fit. Those things are great, when you're in true alignment with them. But when they're just a different identity that I'm hiding behind, it becomes very confusing about who I really am.
Mm-hmm.
And I still dip back into that. There's seasons where I feel like I'm really showing up as me, and then there are seasons where I'm not feeling great about me, and so those walls come up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just being aware of that now when I wasn't in the past is obviously a huge step. And then the question is, okay, so what am I willing to do about that? So it's been very interesting in that. And I would say one of the things that you said, one of the many things you said that I really love, but when we start to drop these facades, even particularly with the people that we're closest to, and we can get to a much deeper relationship. I was sharing with you before we get on that I have a group of men that come out here to Spicewood once a week to be together. And it involves ping pong and pool and making music together. But invariably, every time, there are pockets of us that are together sharing the deepest shit. And it's such a safe space to go there. And, I remember one time in particular, there were probably 5 or 6 of us in the kitchen, and someone shared something that was coming up, and it was just like, boom, boom, boom. It just, the floodgates opened. Mm-hmm. And we realized that we were all very much in the same season, and it was really hard, but it felt reassuring that, and it had taken each of us, we'd been carrying that for a while. So even with these men that I'm really close with, sometimes we're not ready to share, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And then it's invariably, once the first domino falls, everyone's like, fuck, this is what I've been going through. And it's been a motherfucker.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think we, historically, we as men have sat around the fire, and had conversations about what is happening in life. And there's a kind of sharing that happens within that space. And there's usually elderhood that is present to sort of guide the conversation. But I also think that, we have gone through generations of being raised by men who thought that suppression equaled strength, masculine strength, male strength. And so the capacity that you had to just sort of stuff shit down created this false sense of I'm strong, this misinterpretation of what stoicism is actually supposed to be, right? Stoicism is not an elimination of your emotions. It's a domestication of them. It's a relationship building with them. It's that you actually build a foundational relationship with your own emotional body, and you have a mastery with it. But we've sort of taken stoicism and morphed it into something that, like, you need to control your emotions. No, that's not it. That'll never work. It'll just never work, right? And if you try and eliminate them, that'll never work either, right? You know? So, yeah, I mean, I think I love what you're saying, because I think, one of the reasons why, and one of the things that I've been talking about a lot as I've gone on this podcast tour is, like, men, especially young men right now, are really in decline. Foundationally, young men are really in decline. There are less men that are sexually active between the ages of 18 and 29 right now. There are less men graduating college. There are less men in the workforce. And there is the highest rate of men living at home than ever before, right? And we could talk about the data of that. We can talk about why those things are happening, right? 1 in 4 kids are going to grow up without a father in the household. If you're a young boy and you get into the education system, the likelihood of you seeing a male teacher or role model is very fucking small, right? 2% of all kindergarten teachers in America are male, 2%, right? Wow. And then in the education system as a whole, it's only 32% of teachers that are male, and that's declining. And then if you don't have a male teacher, you just don't see what it looks like to be a man within culture and society. Right. So if you don't have a father at home or a father figure, you don't see a man within the education system modeling what that looks like. You literally can go through the majority of your developmental existence as a boy going into manhood and not see the modeling of a healthy male role model. And we as men, we learn by modeling. We learn by, what does our father do with his anger? How does he treat women, right? So we learn how to become men by sort of metabolizing what we see outside of ourselves. And there's just this vacuum, this huge vacancy of male modeling within our culture. And I think that part of the part of the thing that I think is starting to enter into the mainstream conversation is the decline of young men. It's like only 42 or 43% of college graduates this year will be male, and the rest are all female. So that's inverse from 1960 or 1970, where there was this huge sort of inequality of women that were graduating from college. Now it's the opposite, right? So it's actually switched. So I think that a lot of young men are struggling to see even what it looks like to be a man who can deal with his own shit, who can deal with his problems. And I think it's why people like, David Goggins has become so popular. He's willing to talk about, his trauma and what he experienced in life. I think it's why Jordan Peterson, became so popular. He's basically like the dad of the internet, whether you like him or hate him.
Yeah.
He's the archetype of the father. And I think he positioned himself like that very specifically because he recognized in a lot of ways that there's just this massive cohort of young men who are directionless, lacking in any kind of father figure or father energy in their life, lacking in any kind of male modeling in their life, and surrounded by young boys who are experiencing the exact same thing. And it's like, well, that just creates anarchy, like young boys without any kind of, again, like the data shows, the research shows that the role of a father specifically for the young boys is to help them temper their relationship with risk and aggression. I can see this in my boy. He's 2 years old and he's going through this phase right now where he loves to throw himself off the couch and slam shit into the floor and, run across the kitchen and, slam his tricycle into the wall of my brand new house and, and fuck up the baseboard. And I'm like, what are you doing? But I think when well, maybe that's a separate piece, but I think that we actually just need to bring grounded, healthy, masculine energy back into our culture. And how we do that is we bring it back into the conversations. We bring it back into the systems where young men are growing up, right? Education systems, healthcare systems, et cetera. But we bring healthy male modeling back into parenting. And I think that is one of the most important things that we can do for young men, because I just think there's just a generation of young men who are missing that and who, this is the last thing I'll say, who look out at the modern narrative that's being sort of projected out across, Western society and are met with this notion that men aren't needed. So you're not needed in society. And so what do we see? We see young men checking out from society almost entirely. And I think that that's both dangerous and our responsibility to address, And so, yeah, thanks for coming to my TED Talk.
You're hitting on so many important things. And I'm a dad of, I guess, one teenage boy. My other son is 20, but he's, I will still call him a teenager for argument's sake. One of the real gifts of this men's group that I have is that my 17-year-old often comes out here. And so he's, I do the best I can at home to model, but he's around these other men. He gets to have his different experience with them. And it's been really amazing to watch him, who he's drawn to and the conversations that he's willing to have. And, it gives him a great understanding of the others that he's, his peers that he's hanging out with. And he just realizes on some level they're dipshits.
Yeah.
Good enough guys, but he's like, I can't have like real conversations with him. And so he's able to explore these things and hopefully he's able to, share that with these boys on some level. But, these young men, unfortunately, a lot of them aren't turning to, or enough of them aren't turning to someone like Jordan Peterson. And right, whether you agree with his way or not, I happen to really love what he says because there's just a lot of integrity in what and a lot of accountability and self-responsibility, which I think is really lacking today. They're turning to guys like Andrew Tate, who I know very little about, except kind of maybe the big picture stuff. And that's troubling.
Mm.
So it was like, they're going to go somewhere to get their male fix.
Absolutely.
And when you have someone like Andrew Tate, who's super popular and controversial, I mean, that's exciting to explore that. And he paints his own picture, as we all do, of kind of what our message is. But those are the areas where, when we don't have these men in our life, as you were talking about the ratio of teachers, male to female, I happen to have, I feel like, a lot of men teachers in my life. And I mean, granted, that was 30 plus years ago, but it was different then, as I'm sure the stats would show. And I also grew up playing sports. So I was often around other males than my dad. And my dad it's so funny. One of the things I wanted to ask you about actually is as you've become a dad, how is it has it recontextualized your relationship with your dad? And like, are you able to pull in, well, the reason I wanted to ask is because when I became a dad, and for a long time, I didn't want to be like my dad.
Mm-hmm.
I had this idea of someone who didn't love the way I love my kids, show affection and, let's say vulnerability. And so I ended up kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until more recently that I had a deep appreciation for the way he showed up and the way he showed love in the best way he could. And what that in turn gave me.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, kind of the state of being a dad, maybe what you thought it was going to be like and where you find yourself today.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly underestimated how brutal sleep deprivation is. It's like being back in the clubbing days, except there's no rest and it's like every fucking night, but all jokes aside, one of the things that I found this quote by Nietzsche, and I'm going to summarize it. I'm not going to get it verbatim, but essentially it was like the shadow of the father will always be revealed in the son. So the secrets of the father will be revealed in the son. And so one of the things that I've become very aware of, I've been working with men for a decade. I've worked with tens of thousands of guys around the world. And one of the things that I've found cross-culturally is that regardless of our relationship to our father, most of us take one of two paths, which is the way of repetition or the way of opposition. Fuck him, I'm never going to be like him, right? Or he was amazing, I want to be just like him, right? How do I be like him? How do I fill his shoes? He was a great man. How do I step into that? And both of those pathways often don't leave us individuating, becoming the free, sovereign men that hopefully our fathers want us to be, And so I certainly for a while chose the path of trying to repeat and unconsciously repeating some of the stuff that my dad did. My parents got divorced when I was 3. They both remarried other people. They both had a daughter. They both had a son. And so I grew up between these two identical family systems and bounced back and forth where my sisters were the same age, my brothers were the same age.
No shit.
My parents were the same age, but it was like two different family systems. Wow. But the strange part was, and this probably says a lot about me, is that all of them are polar opposites. Like my sisters could not be more different. My dad and my stepdad could not be more different. My mom and my stepmom could not be more different. Like they are just wholly different people. And so I really grew up getting curious about like the differences between people, and I saw the differences between my dad and my stepdad, but I sort of was always chasing and pursuing my father. And because he wasn't around, as much as I wanted him to be as a boy, it left this vacancy in me that I just didn't get. I remember nights when I was 5, 6, 7, 8 years old of just, crying and being inconsolable because I just didn't understand as a young boy why my dad wasn't there.
And this is when you're with your mom or even when you were with him?
Most of the time when I was with my mom.
Okay.
Yeah, because I grew up with her. She had primary custody over me, and then I would see my dad once or twice a month.
Okay.
And, he was loving, he was kind, he was there. But I think we often underestimate the like real desire that and need that a young boy has for his father, right? And I'll just say one thing about research and data to back this up. When you look at a single parent household, and you look at a single mother raising children, statistically speaking, it doesn't have that negative of an impact on young girls. Their education, their grades don't really drop. They don't become violent or drop out of school, those types of things. But when you look at the data about young boys that grow up in single parenthood households where there's no father around, they really struggle. They're much higher likelihood to drop out of school, like 10 times higher. So maybe I'll just give a couple examples, like 88% of high school dropouts come from fatherless homes. 90% of runaway children come from fatherless homes, right? And you can just go down the list and look at the data. And so there's really no argument or conversation around the impact that it has, and specifically around young boys, that young boys have this yearning and desire to be around their fathers. And this was the same for me. I really wanted him to be around. And instead I had a stepfather, I was like, who are you? And why are you here? And I don't understand what the fuck is going on. And so of course I did what every young boy does, which is I rebelled as hard as I possibly could. I made sure that he knew that I did not like him and that I didn't want him there and that I wanted my dad to be there. And I think my parents did the best that they could, with the knowledge and the resources that they had. But it really left this kind of vacancy in me where I pursued him for a very long time and tried to understand him and understand why he left. And this is often what we do as men when we have been wounded in some way emotionally or even physically, is that we try and ask the question, why did this happen? Instead of asking ourselves, what's the impact that's left on me? And so we can spend years and decades in search of, why did this happen? Why did that trauma happen? Why did my dad leave? Why did she break up with me? Why did the divorce happen? Why did the miscarriage happen? And we can become enthralled with that question the entire time, missing out on the impact that it's had on us emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. And so eventually, I came to a place where I realized that I had been in hot pursuit of trying to figure out why my father had left. And when I finally started to do the work internally of understanding the impact that it had on me, it opened up a lot of doors. My life started to shift, my relationship started to change. And so to come back to your question, when my son was born, I think I had done a tremendous amount of searching and self-discovery to heal my relationship with my father. And like I said, just before we were recording, I left out some detail of this, but the day we got home from the hospital, I had interviews with publishing houses for my book. And I had a couple interviews with them. And so after my son was born, I signed my book deal. And it was a very interesting piece because a big part of what I write about is the shadow of our father and actually stepping out of the shadow of our father, good, bad, ugly, whatever our relationship is like, so that we can move on our own sovereign path, so we can take the wisdom and the lessons from that relationship. And so when my son was born, it was interesting because I could feel this very deep desire to share my boy with my father. And it was in the middle of the pandemic, and my dad lives in Canada and we were in the United States. And so traveling across the border wasn't possible. And so it really hit that, reignited that part of me that was like, I want to share life with my dad, but he's just not here. And so I had to have a few conversations with him, because even when the borders did open up, because of some differences and choices that he and I had made, he didn't come down for a little while. And so I had to have some very real conversations with him of like, I need you to show up, and this feels very much like my upbringing and my childhood. And I was like, this is really hard. This is putting a strain on our relationship because this is arguably one of the most important things that I've done in my life, is have this child. Like, this is my son. And so I think in many ways, my boy opened up a sort of deeper layer and a deeper chapter that forced me to have a different type of conversation with my father. And, we had done a lot of work together and we'd had many conversations over the years. And, I spent 2.5 hours with him one time where I had 20 questions for him. It's like, what do you want to do before you die? What are you afraid of happening before you die? And I asked him all these questions and we had this wonderful conversation, and this, this knowing started to emerge between the two of us. But having my son unlocked a lot of that. And I think it also got me very present to how different of a father I will be, not in spite of my dad, not to repeat his patterns, but just because I've actually done the work to become my own man, separate from my stepfather and my father. And that is one of the most empowering things that emerged when my son was born, that I have a really deep sense of gratitude for.
And do you feel like your dad has shown up for your son?
Yeah. And he loves him, he's obsessed.
Yeah.
He's obsessed with him. And I think sometimes he's not quite sure what to do and what his role as a grandfather is, because it's very new for him. It's his first grandchild. And so, but yeah, he really loves him and, FaceTimes, and my wife and I are going on a trip here in May, and my dad and my stepmom are going to come and watch my boy for 7 days, for a full week.
No shit.
Yeah.
Oh, dude.
So it's really wonderful. It's really wonderful.
Well, let's get into the book a little bit.
Sure.
Let me grab it. Get a fresh copy. So for everyone out there, it's called Men's Work, a practical guide to face your darkness, end self-sabotage, and find freedom. Beautiful title. What inspired you to write a book?
A couple things. One, many of the men that I'd worked with had asked me for a kind of like a resource where I could put my framework into writing for them to do it. That was one thing. Two, I think there was a bit of a space within the market. A lot of the books that are out there for men right now were written 20 years ago, right? David Deda's book, Way of the Superior Man, was written 20 plus years ago. No More Mr. Nice Guy, 20 plus years ago. I Don't Want to Talk About It by Terry Real, 20 plus years ago, right? So you have all these sort of foundational books that are just very outdated. And what was interesting is that, because I get guys reach out to me all the time that are like, what resources, what book should I read? What book should I read? What book should I read? And I just started to get this like gut hit that was like, they should be reading my book. And, and one of the things that I started to see was that not a lot of the books that are out there for men are designed to give them tactical work to do. It's like, how do you stop watching pornography? There's a whole section for that, with very specific exercises that you can do. There's questions after every single chapter. So I tried to make it so that, I could condense, like, instead of going to a therapist for 6 to 12 months, it's like, read this book and do the work that's inside of it. And you'll probably gain as much self-understanding as you do going to therapy. Part of my belief is, men's work is about training and not therapy. That we're actually training ourselves to be more competent, more whole, more self-understanding. So those are, and then lastly, I wanted to challenge myself. I failed grade 12 English, but I've always loved writing, and people have always sort of commented that I'm a good writer. And so I wanted to challenge myself in my creativity to do something that pushed my own edge, because that's something that I talk about all the time. Is like, we need to live at our edge a little bit. And this was definitely an edge for me. And I had been encouraging my wife to write a book for a long time. And one day in the conversation, she's like, you keep telling me to write a book. Like, where's yours? Like, all right, babe, touche. And so I got to it. I got to it, and it was, I got told no so many times. I had calls with major publishing houses and heard the same thing from all of them, which was, we love you, we love your message, we love your platform, we love the idea, but men don't buy books. And so it's a no. And that kind of ignited this fire under me that was like, okay, now I really want to do this, And and so we've proven them wrong already.
That's awesome. Now, who started their book first? You or your wife?
I did, yeah.
You did?
Yeah, I started the process first, and got the agent, put the proposal together, started talking to publishing houses, and then after I had signed my book deal, my wife had started sort of coming out of the birthing portal, right? I think our son was like 6 months old. And she's like, maybe I can talk to your agent. She started to get curious. I was like, okay, great. It was awesome. It was wonderful.
And before we get a little deeper into your book, I want to give your wife's book a shout out. Can you share the name of it again and kind of what it's about?
Yeah. So hers is called The Origins of You. And it is about how your family system creates the blueprint for the patterns that show up in your relationship and the 5 primary wounds that come out of our family system. And so basically how to undo those dysfunctional patterns that continue to show up in your relational communication or intimacy or whatever it might be. It's really, really, really powerful book.
Awesome. And what's her name?
Vienna.
Okay.
Yeah, Vienna Farron.
We'll have a link to that in the show notes.
Awesome.
Yeah. All right. So I'm just going to pick, I'm in the table of contents and I've never done this before. I've got this book here.
The dart and the board, like.
Oh, this is beautiful. This is the one that stands out for me. Embrace your anger. And I'll share why it stands out for me. I had a recent realization. I spent almost 18 years as a trader on the floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and the Board of Trade in Chicago. And in that environment, there's a lot of emotion that is able to be expressed in a safe way. Anger being one of them. You can pretty much get anything off your chest that you want and no one's going to take it personally. They may take it personally originally, but everyone lets it go. And I realized in the 10 years since I left the trading floor, there's been a lot of that stored up in me, and I haven't felt the safety to be able to express it. Mm-hmm. And so that's something that I'm currently working on. And so I'd love for you to kind of dive into that as I'm guessing a lot of men have never had the trading floor to express, and maybe they had it on their sports team. But they're, in everyday life, it's maybe not in the way that they understand or the way I understand it. It's not safe to share that with your partner or your kids. So how are you able to share this anger in a way that, everyone doesn't freak out?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there's a great quote by a poet that I deeply love and respect named David White. And he says that anger is the deepest form of care. Anger is the deepest form of care. And so, anger can be the energy of protection, of showing that we care, of showing that we love, of protecting what's sacred to us. But it can also be the tool that's used to destroy the things that we love most. And there's a very fine line between those two things. And so, we as men have to begin to look at what is my specific relationship to anger. As a young man, I saw an example, and sometimes this comes back to the father work oftentimes, right? Because we often learn as young boys, young men, how to express our anger based on the modeling of our parent, of our father. And so as a young man, I thought that anger was either something to be avoided, because I saw that in one of my fathers, or it was violent, verbally, emotionally, and physically abusive. And so my relationship to it was not good. You know, it's like, I didn't want to express it. I didn't want, especially women, to see my anger. But then I would go to bars and nightclubs in my late teens and early 20s and pick bar fights, you know, and beat the shit out of guys. And that obviously wasn't a healthy expression of that. And sometimes get my ass kicked. I also want to like put that in there. It's not like I won every single bar fight. I'm not like, you know, the Mike Tyson of bar fights. I don't want to come across like that. But so we have to begin to understand, what is my relationship to my anger? Is it something that I've disconnected from? Is it something that I've degraded and I don't see value in? Or is it something that I feel overpowered by and powerless to? You know, it can be many things for many men. So in the book, I talk about the different forms of anger, that there's implosive anger, there's explosive anger, and then, you know, there's a kind of sacred anger that we can work towards. And implosive and explosive are a little different. Implosive is when we try and like jump on the grenade, right? So we try and hold all of our anger in. We don't let it out. We don't, you know, tell other people that we're angry. When our girlfriends or our wives say like, you look angry, like you look pissed off about something, we're like, no, I'm good, I'm fine. Meanwhile, inside, we're like, you know, freaking out. And so implosive anger is very common when it comes to a lot of modern guys. A lot of nice guys have implosive anger. And the challenge with implosive anger is that it gets directed towards us. So our internal dialogue, a lot of guys that have implosive anger, the way that they talk to themselves is very abusive, right? What's wrong with me? I'm such a piece of shit. Like, why can't I just get this shit right? Blah, 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 blah. So our inner dialogue and our inner critic becomes very vicious and abusive and violent. Explosive is where we feel a sense of powerlessness to our anger, and it just sort of rules us and it takes over, and we find ourselves yelling at people or threatening people or attacking their character, becoming louder, etc. Explosive anger can also be something where we have a sense of self-entitlement and righteousness, right? It's like, well, I deserve to be angry. I deserve to tell you, you know, what's wrong with you and call you out and call you on your bullshit. And I'm just expressing my truth, or, you know, whatever justification we use for that. So that's explosive anger. And both of them are equally damaging and destructive in their own way. Now, how do we actually move towards embracing our anger? There's a couple things that we need to do. First and foremost, if you have implosive anger, you actually need to work towards expression, of letting that anger have a little bit of a voice. Because the reality is that your anger is a marker for when boundaries have been crossed, right? And boundaries teach other people how to treat us. And so if you're trying to reinforce your boundaries by being explosive, or you're trying to avoid hurting somebody by holding in your anger and not saying anything about when you're upset, you know, when your partner says something disrespectful or you feel hurt about something or whatever it is, then your anger never has a place at the table. So you're disempowered. So if you have implosive anger, we have to start to work towards expression, towards bringing that anger out. And a good way to do that is to just label, I'm feeling angry right now. And to practice that, and I would say to practice that with other men. This is the power of men's work and men's groups specifically, is that it might be harder for you with your wife of 10 years or your girlfriend who's brand new to say, I feel really angry right now. That might feel like too much. But in a group of guys, it might be easier for you to say, you know what? I'm really angry about X, Y, and Z that's happening at work. So the first step for implosive is to actually just start to give voice to the truth about when you're angry. And the same thing is true with explosive. The first step is to give voice about when you're angry without directing, without saying, I'm angry and it's your fault. You're responsible for this, right? So step one, name that it's there. Step two, say what you're actually feeling behind the anger. So the majority of the time, anger is going to be a secondary emotion. It will have shown up because you felt embarrassed, you felt ashamed, you felt disrespected, you felt hurt, you felt something before you got angry. And the anger is an attempt to express that other emotion that maybe feels even more threatening to admit. So say what you're actually feeling. You know what? I feel embarrassed that I forgot to buy the chicken at the grocery store and I totally forgot, right? Say what you're actually feeling. That's the next step. And then the third one is move from cognition to what I call the DFE, to your direct felt experience. Move from cognition to direct felt experience. So where most of us men get lost with our anger is we just stay in our thoughts. We try and rationalize our way through an emotional problem, right? We use rational math for emotional equations. And they're two different things. It's like trying to communicate in Chinese, but you're speaking German. It's not going to go well, right? So move into the direct felt experience. What does that anger feel like in your body? Where do you feel it? Where do you sense it? Do you feel heat in your belly? Do you feel like your hands, want to move? Do you feel your feet wanting to move? And start to become more and more aware and more present to the actual sensory data and experience of anger itself. The majority of men don't have a problem with expressing anger or experiencing it. It's that they feel unsafe with it. It's that there's no real tolerance and self-trust to say, I can sit with this. So one of the things that I had to do that I found to be very helpful, and I'll pause here, was I created something called the fire meditation, which was every time that I felt really angry, especially in my relationship, because this seems to be an access point for a lot of men where their anger just shows up naturally. Whenever I felt really angry, I would go and sit down and I would set a timer for 3 to 5 minutes and I would close my eyes and I would just breathe and feel into the sensations of the anger in the body. Because in order for other people to feel safe and to trust us with our anger, we need to feel safe and trust ourselves with our anger, right? I wrote in the book, if you don't deal with your anger, the world will have to deal with it for you. So one of the best things that we can do is actually to build a tolerance for the experience of our anger so that it's not too much for us, so that we're not running away from it, that we actually take intentional time to sit and be with our anger when it's present. And in doing so, we begin to develop a relationship with it. And we begin to have a sense of trust that we can be with our own anger when it shows up. So in the moment when, your wife, your girlfriend, your kid, or your boss or colleague says something and you feel that anger arising in the body, you have a context of, no, I know how to be with this experience. I know how to be with this emotion. This isn't too much. I don't need to shut down. I don't need to react from it and blow up. Because that's what most of us do, right? Most men, we use two ways of dealing with our anger. We try and shut down and stuff it down, or we act from it. And we have to learn how to be with our anger and be present for it and have the tolerance for it and express it when necessary, but not because we're just letting that anger react out from us. So those are a couple of things that people can do real time in order to work with their anger.
Oh, that's awesome. So what's the kind of, besides your own experience with this, what are some of the things that have helped shape your what you're sharing here in the book with specific regards to anger?
The big one is Jungian psychology. The book is sort of built on the foundation of shadow work, which is a concept that Jung talked about. So that's a pretty big piece. And then Gestalt, my current mentor and man that I work with, he's also in his 70s. He's a Gestalt therapist. And Gestalt is really built off of this notion of wholeness, of inviting all the parts in us that we maybe have discarded, don't want to be in relationship to, bringing them back into our inner kingdom. Because as men, we try and exile the parts of us that we don't. It's like, It's like, oh, I don't like this character in my inner kingdom. How do I kill that part off? How do I banish that part? And it just empowers that part. We start to have this inner civil war that goes on. And so the book really has a lot of tools. A lot of the exercises are based on Jungian and Gestalt frameworks.
Beautiful. That was a beautiful share. And that's just one small part of this book. I'm really excited to dive into it. And I'm thinking that share is going to inspire many people to come out and do that as well, particularly men. But I do think there's so much in it for women to just try to understand, what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I agree. I've had a lot of women writing me being like, I read your book. My husband makes so much more sense now.
Yeah. We just want to understand each other.
That's it.
Yeah. So how can people work with you? Are you still doing coaching and?
Yeah. So I run some online groups. I do a lot of in-person live weekends. My wife and I are doing some couples workshops, both live and digital, because she's a marriage and family therapist and she's awesome. So best way is just ManTalks.com. You can see everything there. I don't do as much one-on-one. I'll usually do like intensives with men, where they'll come out and work with me for a day or two, or I'll create some form of initiatory experience for them. And then the rest of it is all small group work, like 8 men or, a weekend with a bunch of guys. So all on mantalks.com. And then you can follow, Instagram. I post every day and I try and answer messages and do all that jazz. So you can follow me at ManTalks on Instagram.
Dude, amazing. I'm so glad you're here in Austin to do this, this tour. And I'm glad we got to do this. Really just awesome stuff, brother.
Likewise.
Really appreciate you.
Likewise. Thanks so much for the conversation. And I got some love from the dog beforehand.
Oh, yeah.
I've felt so welcomed in Austin. It's been really amazing. It's been really, really wonderful.
Well, no one's been quite welcomed like that before. So that's on you.
Well, thanks again. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, you bet.